We are, as you know, coming this morning to the second of the two most famous personalities associated with the Reformation, and that is John Calvin. Now let me do a sound check. Is it okay? So as you know, in the tradition of the Reformation, we have two broad branches that have come down to us. One of them going back to Luther, and we call that the Lutheran tradition, and the other is called the Reformed tradition, and it goes back to John Calvin. We as Presbyterians are particularly interested in Calvin because we are part of that Reformed heritage, although certainly we have cordially appreciated the Lutheran tradition as well, and we were born at the same time in history, and so there's no great animosity there, just simply two different traditions. And it really began, as I was indicating to you a couple of weeks ago, at the Colloquy of Marburg, where Luther and his followers couldn't quite get on the same page, not with Calvin, but with Zwingli. And there was some thought years later that maybe if Calvin had been there, they could have found common cause at that point, but it never happened. So we have these two traditions. John Calvin is a great consolidator. He was a second generation, 25 years after the birth of Luther. Calvin comes on the scene, 1509, and so he is kind of the one who comes along in the second wave, you might say. In many ways, people would say he's the one that was able to pull together in a consolidated and somewhat systematic way the gains that had been produced by the thought of Luther. Luther never wrote a systematic theology, but Calvin did. So his work, which is called the Institutes, really spelled out in a kind of broad, organized way the thought of the Reformation. Luther was more the flowering genius, which Calvin often called him himself. Calvin was more of a systematizer of the thought. So it was really nice that the two came in that order, you see, and it sort of gave then to the Reformation tradition this well-rounded balance between two very different personalities. Luther, a lot more bombastic, a lot more upfront, a lot more kind of just personality. Calvin, more retiring, harder to get at in terms of his personality. He didn't like the limelight as much, and so we have really a nice complement between these two in many ways. The text of Scripture that I've been thinking about in connection with Calvin is in chapter 20 of Acts, starting at verse 25. It's the occasion when the Apostle Paul is finishing up his third missionary journey. And he's on his way back to Jerusalem, where he anticipates that difficulties may await him. And he stops on his way and talks to the elders of the Ephesian church. And he gives them kind of his farewell sermon. And in this sermon, he more or less defends in a way the ministry that he'd had among them over some 3 years on that third journey. I heard Kevin Finch say once in a sermon years back, every preacher has only 7 sermons and they just keep recycling them. I've done a little preaching over the years and I think I've only got about 3, so I think they're actually ahead of me, the guys that do it professionally. I don't think that's true of Calvin. And the reason I'm mentioning this text is because in it you'll hear this phrase that Calvin didn't shrink from declaring the whole counsel of God. I'm sorry, Paul didn't. And Calvin, I think, might have said the same thing. So let's read this text. This is in Acts chapter 20, beginning at verse 25. And as I say, this is Paul now talking to these Ephesian elders at the end of his third missionary journey. This is the word of God. And now I know that none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will ever see my face again. Therefore I declare to you this day that I am not responsible for the blood of any of you. For I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. Keep watch over yourselves and over all the flock, of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God that he obtained with the blood of his own Son. I know that after I have gone, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Some even from your own group will come, distorting the truth, in order to entice the disciples to follow them. Therefore be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to warn everyone with tears. And now I commend you to God and to the message of His grace, a message that is able to build you up and give you the inheritance among all who are sanctified. I coveted no one's silver or gold or clothing. You know for yourselves that I worked with my own hands to support myself and my companions. In all this I've given you an example that by such work we must support the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus, for He Himself said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." And with the exception of a few little details in that text, I think Calvin, toward the end of his life, might have said something like that to the folks of Geneva and to many others whose life he had touched over the years. Certainly, he didn't shrink from declaring the whole counsel of God. Usually when people hear the name Calvin, they think of Calvinism. And Calvinism is associated with a particular theology that really emphasizes the sovereignty of God in salvation, and that is part of certainly Calvin's instruction. But at that point, Calvin contributed nothing unique. Luther had said as much in his writings, The Bondage of the Will especially, and both Luther and Calvin were really simply replicating the views that had been announced by St. Augustine 1,000 years earlier. And so at this point, Calvin is no innovator. But there are plenty of places in our Christian understanding where he was plowing up new ground and doing work that had really not been done before and filling in some of the blanks, and really was responsible in a sense for declaring the whole counsel of God in a way that those who had gone before had not really been able to accomplish. And so that's why I say I think Calvin had more than 7 sermons. But in any event, we'll have to assess that as we go along this morning. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Our Father, we're grateful for your constant mercies to us. We thank you for this opportunity once again to be here with your people to consider the history, the unfolding story of your work through the ages, through ordinary folks like us, as well as through remarkable souls that come along from time to time, like John Calvin. We pray that our assessment of his life would be fair and even-handed, that we would be biased neither too much in favor of him or hostile to him, but simply to appreciate that he was one more of these remarkable characters that you used to shape the course of history and produce the world and the church in which we now labor and serve. And for all of this, we give you thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. As I say, Calvin was born in 1509. So Luther was about 25 years old by now. Luther was a monk. In fact, he had just become a professor at the University of Wittenberg at the time that Calvin was born. I'm going to give you his life in several chapters, as I tend to do. And so we'll think first of all of his career as a student. He was born July 10th in Picardy. He's a Frenchman. So we probably should call his name something like Jean Calvin, But I don't do French very well, and so I'm going to go conventional here, as most folks do, John Calvin. But he certainly was French throughout his being, his DNA, and throughout his career. He was a great tribute, a great sort of source of pride, I would say, to France, even though at the time they didn't really appreciate it that much. He was a brilliant student. His father was a lawyer and was part of that rising middle class we've talked about in prior weeks. His father was very successful and fairly well-to-do, so you might say he was kind of upper middle class. His mother was a devout Roman Catholic, and so he grew up in a fairly serious and rather academically oriented family with a deep devotional spirit to it. And Calvin viewed himself as a faithful son of the church and had no idea whatsoever that he would be discussed hundreds of years later for departing from the Roman Catholic faith, which he eventually did. He was originally going to be studying for the priesthood. That was what usually happened with very bright and precocious students. They would become priests or go into some sort of religious order, and that was the original plan. But Calvin's father had a bit of a falling out with the church, not that he left the Catholic Church, but it was more of a political kind of difference that came along. And so his father told Calvin when he was in his mid-teenage years and in the middle of his studies that he should divert his attention academically to the study of law. And so when Calvin was just in his mid-teenage years, having progressed pretty rapidly, he entered the University of Orleans, which is connected to the University of Paris, one of those free universities that had come following the Crusades, one of the most prestigious, and Orleans was almost like one of the departments of that university, but there he studied law, beginning in 1525. He, however, was so taken with the new learning that was really coming out through the Renaissance and the rediscovery of classical sources and classical languages and so on, as many people were, that he really deemed himself more appropriate for a kind of scholarly career in which he would represent part of this new kind of wave of academic interest that was going back to the original sources. We've talked about that in connection to the Renaissance. So he was really kind of a Renaissance scholar in his own self-image at this time, and he was continuing his studies past law school to head in that direction. His conversion to the Reformed faith took place sometime between 1529, not before that, and not later than 1533. And it's hard to pin down precisely what the circumstances were. He's not as self-disclosing as Luther. And so we have to do a little more triangulating as we go along to get some of the pieces to fit together. But we know it was sometime in this time frame that it took place, and we have a few little pieces of the puzzle here that at least are useful. He was continuing his studies at the time at Montaigu, which was also connected to the University of Paris, and at the time, in 1529, he voiced his contempt for a movement in France that was pejoratively referred to as the Gospelers. And these were people who were touched by the Lutheran Reformation and were so filled with the gospel that was kind of the insulting name that was applied to them, the Gospelers, you know. If you know the history of this time, you know eventually these people were called the Huguenots. But at this time, this is kind of the early reference to them. And Calvin had nothing but disdain for these Gospelers. And he thought the entire Lutheran movement was a heretical movement and that it was working to damage the church, and he had nothing but support for those who were trying to stamp out this Lutheran heresy and the Gospelers there in France. So we know that was his attitude in 1529. Things got a little bit dicier for him about that time based on a friendship that he had with a friend of his who was also a cousin of his named Peter Robert, or probably pronounced Pierre Robert, but we'll go with Peter Robert. And the two of them were close friends. Peter Robert was himself also very academically oriented, brilliant, and the two of them formed a fast friendship. But as John Calvin and Peter Robert would interact, it became a kind of subtle suspicion somewhere down inside of Calvin's soul that Peter Robert himself was tilting toward these Gospelers. You know, he never said it, but Calvin began to detect in some of the ways that he would describe his view of them and his view of things in general. And it put Calvin in a bit of a conflict of conscience, because the more he became convinced of this, the more he became convinced that his duty as a Roman Catholic would be to turn in his cousin, report him to the authorities. And he knew that if the Inquisition were launched against his friend, he would likely be found guilty and would likely pay for his faith by being burned at the stake, which was quite a common form of execution at the time in France for people who were associated with this Gospeler movement. So Calvin, who loved his friend and cousin, had this conflict of conscience that was being aggravated. The more he talked to Peter Robert, the more he was feeling this anxiety over this point. Calvin's principal kind of life ethic was obedience. That's what he wanted for himself. That's what he believed all Christian people should embrace. And so this put him in this rather ticklish position. It was in the midst of this kind of crisis of conflict, of conscience, that he had a very interesting experience one day. He'd been studying, as he often did, late into the night at the university, and he was making his way home well after dark. The street lights were lit and so on, and he was walking along down a fairly dark street toward his apartment, which is about 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden, quite unexpectedly, this old man came out of the alley and grabbed Calvin by the nape of the neck. Now, Calvin was kind of a wimp, you know. He was fairly slight, didn't have an ounce of fat on him, and not very athletic. So, and this old guy just grabs him and yanks him up, gets right in his face, and says to him something like this: "Young man, have you heard of God's free gift?" You know, Calvin's terrified. What to do with this fellow? He had immediately knew this had to be one of those gospelers, and he didn't want to be seen with him. He didn't want to be associated with him. He just wanted to get away, and he kind of wriggled and squirmed and finally was able to distance himself. "Come on, man." Calvin went home shaken up, got back to his apartment, closed the door, and thought, wow, what was that? And kind of forgot about it then. So about a week later, Calvin is going home, this time in the middle of the day. And as he's going down the street, he looks down about a block away and he sees a crowd gathering. And you know how it is when you see a crowd gathering, you're sort of drawn to it, what's going on. And so Calvin himself, curious, begins to kind of meander in that direction, just finding out what was going on. And he realizes soon enough, one of those sights that was not all that uncommon in those days, somebody was about to be executed for heresy by being burned at the stake. And as he got a little closer, he realized the man who was about to be burned was none other than that old man who had accosted him just a week earlier. And Calvin stood at a distance and watched and was impressed with the equanimity of this old man. No pleading for his life, no tears, no kind of pathetic expressions or begging for mercy. He just stood there with a kind of calm repose. And as the fire was lit, the man began to sing a song. It was a song that had been written about 1 year earlier. You may have heard of it. It's called "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." And this old man still had a strong voice, and without apology, he began to sing, "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing." And the flames came up around him and finally silenced his voice. And Calvin was deeply, deeply moved by that entire incident. We don't have any reason to think that was the moment of his conversion. It probably wasn't, but it certainly did exacerbate the conscience that was already conflicted within him, as he was appreciative of Peter Robert and yet concerned about the implications it had for his own Roman Catholic understanding. And now to see this man evidencing such grace in his life in the face of this horrific death, all of it stirred up a great deal of emotion in Calvin at that point. And the other thing that took place about this time, he was working on his first publication. This is certainly before he was converted. It was called De Clementia. It was a commentary on Seneca, the Stoic philosopher of the first century. It was a commentary on Seneca's treatment of the subject of judicial clemency. Seneca had argued that he thought this ferocious form of public executions that took place in Rome, crucifixions, that sort of thing, was actually counterproductive. And Seneca was arguing that there should be some place for judicial clemency and mercy, and that might actually have a more positive effect generally in the Roman world. And Calvin was always taken with that, even before his conversion. Calvin was a strong opponent of this form of execution, burning at the stake. Many people who seize on something that appears to be a black eye in the career of Calvin, if you've ever heard anything about him from his critics, you will have heard of the execution of Peter Servetus in Geneva that took place years later. And I've heard this statement made by people who should know better, and they'll say, well, John Calvin burned Michael Servetus at the stake. Well, that's not true. In fact, if anything, Calvin argued against burning the man at the stake. He was trying to argue for clemency. That was always his interest. We'll talk about that later. But just to kind of plant the seed here, he was wondering about this Catholic approach to enforcing orthodoxy, and all of this was stirring in his soul at this time. And so it was a rather complicated time for him. And again, I say we don't know exactly when his conversion took place, but it was sometime along this, in this time frame. We know that his conversion took place at least by 1533, and we know that the conflicted state of his conscience was constantly on his mind. And so these are a couple of short snippets from descriptions he himself gave of what he was going through at this time. The first one reads, being exceedingly alarmed at the misery into which I had fallen, and much more at that which threatened me, in view of eternal death, I, duty bound, made it my first business to betake myself to your way, condemning my past life, not without groans and tears. And now, O Lord, what remains to a wretch like me? But instead of defense, earnestly to supplicate you not to judge that fearful abandonment of your word according to its deserts, from which in your wondrous goodness you have at last delivered me. Calvin was sensing at this point, in a sense, the uselessness of all that he had done up to this time. He thought his labor, his focus, his obedience were a basis upon which he could claim some kind of merit. And now the more he thought about it, the more he realized the paucity and the bankruptcy of all of that. And yet he felt at the same time that he hadn't really achieved that sense of a forgiven conscience. Even here, you still sense a little bit of that. But at some point along the way, he describes the following, quote, God by a sudden conversion subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein, that although I did not altogether leave off other studies, yet I pursued them with less ardor. So somewhere along the line, he caved. And he describes it as a rather sudden thing, although he certainly was struggling for some time. And something like St. Augustine, in fact, this writing almost sounds like the Confessions, in which he describes the wrestling match he was going through, but at some point, it seems the lights came on for him and he surrendered to this Reformation faith, justification by faith alone, as it had been spelled out to him now by these people that he was acquainted with. So we know it took place at some point along the line. Precise timing is not clear, but we do know it was by 1533 because of what happened at this moment. Another close associate of his was a man named Nicholas Kopp. Nicholas Kopp was quite a highly esteemed scholar himself, a philosopher, and he had just been elected the rector of the University of Paris, which would be something like being its president. It would be a very prestigious post, and it was expected that people who were going to assume that kind of responsibility would give a major academic address to the faculty and to others who would come and be in attendance. And so Nicholas Kopp, on this occasion, got up to give this rather lengthy and erudite address on some point of academic interest to all of the assembled faculty and so on. And as he was speaking, the audience, and especially the more astute faculty members, became increasingly restive. And you began to hear a little bit of bustling and noise, and it increasingly, there was a little bit of a crescendo to it. It was increasing as he went along, because it gradually dawned on people that what Nicholas Kopp was actually doing was giving a very erudite and academically respectable defense of Lutheran Reformation theology, you see. And so the faculty, though this was not a Catholic school, it was a free university, nevertheless all of these people, of course, maintained their allegiance to the Catholic Church. And literally, Nicholas Kopp had to flee from the stage at the end. His inaugural address became his swan song. And he ran off the stage and actually escaped from Paris on horseback, you see, as a result of this speech that he gave. People did a little research and discovered that the ghostwriter of the speech that Nicholas Kopp had delivered was none other than our friend John Calvin. And so John Calvin at that point became a wanted man himself, and so this brings us to the third chapter of his life. I'm calling Calvin the fugitive. He was not able to get out of town as quickly as Nicholas Kopp. Kopp almost, I think, expected this. He had the getaway car kind of waiting with the engine running outside the door, so he got out of town. Calvin hadn't thought ahead quite that well, so Nicholas Kopp wound up in Basel. Basel is a city, of course, as you know, in Switzerland. Switzerland at this point, constituted by multiple what are called cantons, like provinces, was going both ways. Each canton had its own independent autonomy and could decide whether to stay with the Reformation or go with stay with the Roman Catholic Church or go with the Reformation. And the city of Basel, kind of that city-state, had decided to go with the Reformation. And so Nicholas Kopp went to Basel, which was sort of a refuge then for him and others like him. But Calvin was not able to get out of town quite so quickly, and actually was on the lam in France for about a year, or at least for several months, more or less having to hide and stay in the shadows and stay out of the public eye and so on. Finally, however, he was able to escape the following year in 1534 by dressing up as a peasant worker, a very good disguise, and he sort of shuffled out the gate along with some other people, and somehow the metal detector didn't pick him up, and he was able to get away. And so he went to Basel as well. And so John Calvin joined his friend Nicholas Kopp, and the two of them were there for a couple of years, and of course this is kind of a time of being officially a fugitive. But then it brings us to 1536, when Calvin actually begins what you'd call his real ministry. I'm calling this Calvin the pastor. That may not be quite the right word, but he certainly does some pastoral ministry during this time. The most important thing that happened over this couple of years is that he produced a document called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, if you're familiar with the Institutes, you know it's a pretty good-sized, 2-volume work. And it may seem a little striking that a 27-year-old guy who's a fairly new convert could produce that. He did produce the skeleton of it. So when he's about 27 years old, this document is produced, but it was a very short version of it. It was more of a pamphlet, a kind of short apology for the Reformation tradition and for the Reformation theology. He addressed it to Francis I, who was the King of France, with a lengthy kind of preface dedicating the work to him and hoping that he would have a more benign attitude toward these folks who were part of the Reformation there. We don't know if the king ever saw it or took any note of it, but anyway, that was its stated purpose. But this Institutes of the Christian Religion spread like wildfire. Just like Luther's 95 Theses had earlier swept through Europe, it didn't take long for this shortened version of the Institutes to similarly sweep through Europe. It was translated into multiple languages and became kind of a staple item throughout Europe of people who were associated with the Reformation as it was gradually developing. The problem was nobody knew who wrote it, because Calvin wrote it anonymously. He didn't have to. He was in a safe place. So it wasn't that he was doing it for self-protection, but he was so embarrassed at how ambitious he had been earlier, how much he wanted public esteem through his writings. He wanted to be recognized as a great scholar. And even though he was a retiring personality, there was plenty of ego going on there. And so his first writing, the De Clementia, he was constantly down to the publisher's office. How's it selling? How's it doing? Has it made the New York Times bestseller list? He was constantly worried about it. The second one, he didn't want any of that. So he wrote it, and it was this overnight sensation, and nobody knew who wrote it. But they figured it out eventually. But anyway, at the beginning, this was probably the most important thing he produced right in that time frame. Certainly was the most important. Things settled down in France at the same time, and he returned to France, but just about the time he showed up, there was an edict from the king called the Edict of Coucy. And I'm not going to go into the details, but the long and short of it was it changed once again the policies in France and put Calvin in something of an awkward position, so once again he had to flee. So he was only in France there briefly. This time he went south, and he went to Ferrara. which is a little province in Italy, which happened to be under the rule of a woman by the name of Renee of Ferrara. It may be you've never heard of her, but she was one of the most important kind of quiet forces at this time. And I want to do a little vignette about her, not today, but when we come back. But just for now, I want you to know, Calvin showed up in her court. She was already tilting heavily toward the Reformation. She formed a fast, lifetime friendship with Calvin. He worked in her court for about 6 months as a court secretary and had a huge impact on her, really solidified her deep understanding of the Reformation faith, and she used quite a bit of political clout over the next several years to protect people, both in Italy and in France, who were adhering to the Reformation understanding of things. And so she became quite an interesting person in her own right, but Calvin is there briefly. When things had settled down a bit, he decided he was going to head for Strasbourg. Strasbourg is in Germany. It was probably one of the most important cities in Europe at that time as a kind of bastion of Reformation, refugees and so on, and he thought that would be a place where he could probably carry on his studies more efficiently, and so he decided to take off for Strasbourg, and he left Ferrara and went through Switzerland on his way to Strasbourg and stopped off for the night in Geneva. Motel 6, he just checks in, not trying to be noticed or anything. He got there late at night, intended to leave the next morning and continue his journey to Strasbourg. Well, by this time, people knew that John Calvin had written the Institutes. They figured that out, and somebody spotted John Calvin coming into town, checking into the hotel, and passed word on to a guy by the name of William Farel. William Farel was the leader of the Reformation in Geneva. In Geneva at the time, there had been an official decision, this is in Switzerland, again another canton, had decided to go with the Reformation. William Farel was the leader of this, but it was an extraordinarily difficult and complicated situation in Geneva. Even though they had made the decision to go with the Reformation, those people who were arriving in Geneva, in many cases, had extraordinarily distorted understandings of what the Reformation really stood for. And the principal view that was out there that was creating the problems was a group called the Libertines. And the Libertines, in the name of the Reformation, argued for some preposterous ideas. For example, they said, we are justified by faith alone, therefore it doesn't matter a bit how we live. In fact, we can prove that we're justified by faith alone by living licentious lives of debauchery and drunkenness and sexual immorality, and by so doing we really take a strong stand to preach the gospel that is justification by faith alone. Now, Luther would never, ever, ever countenance anything like that, nor would Calvin, nor would any responsible representative of the Reformation understanding. That kind of accusation has often been made, but responsible representatives of the theology of justification by faith alone repudiate it out of hand. So please be clear about it. Paul himself was accused of that. Romans chapter 3, we see evidence of that. And he repudiated it. And so this movement represented not only a misunderstanding of the Reformation, but a slander of the Reformation. And there they were in large numbers in Geneva. So much so that they had virtually created a kind of red light district in Geneva in the name of the Reformation, you see. So this is what William Farel was dealing with. And he needed somebody with the intellectual clout to persuade the leaders of the city and kind of the general population of the city how abhorrent this was, and hopefully to lead the city in a more responsible and balanced pursuit of what the Reformation should really stand for. And here came John Calvin, this young genius who had produced the Institutes. And so William Farel couldn't resist the temptation. He goes over to the Motel 6. Calvin was already in bed. Bangs on the door. Calvin, he's, whoa, what is this? He didn't know what was going on. He opens the door, and there's William Farel, who announces his presence. and says that he'd like to come in and visit with John for a moment. So John Calvin invites him in, and they sit down, and William Farel began pleading, beseeching, begging John Calvin to stay in Geneva. Don't go to Strasbourg, stay here and join in the work that I'm doing to make the city of Geneva a city where the Reformation can truly flourish in the proper expression of what it really represents. Calvin had 3 words for Farel. In your dreams. Said, he did not want to be an upfront guy. This was not his calling. He said, you know, I am a scholar. I want to do scholarly work. I will write, and I'm going to find a nice little cubicle with my books and my papers, and I'm going to write, and I'll do what I can for the Reformation for sure, but I am not a kind of guy that's going to be up there in the limelight, and that's just not my interest. Farel didn't like that answer, and he kept upping the pressure. And finally, when Calvin made it clear in no uncertain terms that he did not intend to stay, he was going to leave the next morning, Farel gave what Calvin later called Farel's dreadful imprecation. And he describes it in these words. I need my glasses here, so you'll... Then Farel, this is Calvin describing this incident, who was working with incredible zeal to promote the gospel, bent all his efforts to keep me in the city. And when he realized that I was determined to study in privacy in some obscure place, and saw that he gained nothing by entreaty, he descended to cursing, and said that God would surely curse my peace if I held back from giving help at a time of such great need. Terrified by his words, and conscious of my own timidity and cowardice, I gave up my journey and attempted to apply whatever gift I had in defense of my faith. So Calvin was no match for the fire of William Farel, and he remained there in the city. Probably the first incident that took place, which really showed the genius of Calvin, took place only a couple of months later. And this is called the Lausanne Disputation. Lausanne was another of these city-states in Switzerland that was having to decide which way we're going to go. Go with the Roman Catholic tradition or adopt the new Reformation view. And so each of these city-states there in Switzerland was having a similar kind of discussion. But Lausanne was a major city, and so the direction it went was viewed as being highly important to the overall outlook of things in Switzerland. And so this disputation was going to take place all day long on a certain occasion in which representatives of the Catholic tradition would be there, experts and scholars, and people representing the Reformation tradition would be there, and they would have a public dispute, a public debate, and the leaders of Lausanne and the people of Lausanne would listen, and at the end of the day decide. So it was just, kind of an open public conversation along those lines. William Farel wanted very much to be there and influence the proceedings in any way that he could, and he very much wanted John Calvin to be in attendance as well. And so the two of them traveled together the distance to Lausanne and showed up. And as the proceedings unfolded, it became clear that those people representing the Reformation were truly outgunned. That those who had come representing the Roman Catholic view were superior in their scholarship, superior in their academic capabilities. They were more able debaters and so on, and it just felt like the whole mood was drifting pretty heavily toward the Roman Catholic choice. And William Farel, of course, was increasingly frustrated by this, and he wasn't able to say much that was actually influencing the proceeding, and so he kept elbowing John Calvin. You know how it is? Yeah, would you say something? And Calvin's just sitting there. He just wants to be quiet. Finally, Calvin, toward the end of the day, when it seemed like pretty much all was lost for the Reformation, Calvin did stand up. He was just out in the gallery, and he stood up and addressed himself to this small cluster of Catholic scholars and asked them about 3 questions. Questions that were sufficiently penetrating that it became clear this guy would not be so easily dusted off. And they gave a couple of answers that were actually sounded good but were not adequate, and Calvin knew it. and he proceeded at that point on to talk for about an hour. He had no notes. He spoke strictly off the top of his head, quoting from memory at length church fathers, major sections of Scripture, and other sources, showing such a ranging command of the material that he absolutely silenced those who were on the other side, so that by the time he sat down, which was about an hour later, the whole place was in a kind of silent hush. Then there was a character by the name of John Tandy. He was one of these Catholic scholars. He was a Franciscan. He was a preacher. He was an enemy of the Protestant movement, and he stood up and he made the following short speech, quote, "Based on what I have just heard, I confess that I have sinned against the Spirit and rebelled against the truth. Because of ignorance, I have lived in error and spread wrong teaching. I ask God's pardon and the forgiveness of the people of Lausanne. I give up my role as a friar. From now on, I will follow Christ and His pure teaching alone." It's one of the most astonishing and dramatic moments in the early career of John Calvin. And at that point, it became increasingly apparent what a powerful force he was going to be for the ongoing development of this movement. He returned with William Farel to Geneva for two of the most miserable, horrific years of his life. Later, he said, if anything could be hell on earth, this was it. It was awful. And the reason it was awful was because these libertines hated John Calvin. They hated his principle of public decency and morality. Some of you who are familiar with Calvin, and especially with some of the caricatures of Calvin that have come down to us, mostly from his enemies, may have an impression in your mind that is something like this: that Calvin liked to wander through the streets of Geneva, sort of like Diogenes wandered through the marketplace of Athens looking for an honest man. You know that image of the lantern in broad daylight? And Calvin was looking through Geneva looking for sinful people and looking under every rock, and so that's kind of the picture people have of him, like this hyper-moralist who was running around trying to catch perfectly ordinary, innocent people doing bad things so that he could make their lives miserable. I tell you, nothing could be further from the facts of the matter, but it is those who wanted to kind of distort our view of him who've perpetrated that. That image comes from this moment in history when you have this open, licentious expression of a kind of highly distorted understanding of the Reformation, and Calvin trying to establish the principle that the Christian faith calls us to public decency and public morality, and that this kind of life will not do in such a community. And that was exactly what he did, and for that reason he was made the brunt of all kinds of jokes. Every joke that was invented during those 2 years had John Calvin as the punchline for it. On multiple occasions as he was walking down the street, he was hit by the water closet pot, that kind of thing. Chamber pot, yeah. He was, in other words, it was a horrific and miserable time. He hated every day of it. He only stayed there out of a sense of duty. 2 years later, these libertines had had such influence in the city that they actually ran John Calvin and William Farel out of town. It was the happiest day of Calvin's life. He was so happy to be run out of town, and he finally was able to complete the journey he had begun 2 years earlier and go to Strasbourg, which is where he'd been wanting to go all along. And he was there for 3 years, and these were 3 of the happiest years of his life. And so it was almost as if God rewarded him with a little reprieve after this time of just terrific pain and torment there in Geneva. Several things happened while he was here in Strasbourg. He preached every Sunday at a little church which was called the St. Nicholas Church, Strasbourg, still there to this day. Some of you may have been there. The building looks a little different than it did in Calvin's day, but he was a pastor. And he was also influenced by a much older man who gave him a lot of counsel as to pastoral skills, a man named Martin Bucer. And so they formed a fast friendship. And Calvin, sort of as a young man now, is kind of honing his professional skills as a pastor. He was a great academic. He wasn't so great at bedside manner, that kind of thing, So this was where he really got some help and really distinguished himself as a very widely beloved and appreciated pastor. He published at this time his second edition of the Institutes. It was a growing work. Over the years, he republished it many times. Each time it came out a little bigger. I might mention to you on the side, I read one chapter out of the Institutes every day. It's just good for your soul. You should do that. I remember Dale Bruner once saying, we should read one page out of the Book of Confessions every day. I can't tell you I do that, but I plan to, But Calvin is wonderful reading. It just is good, it clears your head. And so anyway, this is the growing work. And he also published a commentary on Romans at that time. But maybe the most interesting thing he did at this time was he married a woman by the name of Idelette de Bure. It's interesting because he had earlier said this about marriage. He said, quote, "I who have the air of being so hostile to celibacy, I am still not married, and do not know whether I ever will be. If I take a wife, it will be because, being better freed from numerous worries, I can devote myself to the Lord." So you have a little bit of a kind of an academic attitude here, toward marriage. Not exactly like he's just has this robust desire to be married, but it's like, if it comes along, it'll be fine. That was sort of his attitude before he met Idelette de Bure. Idelette de Bure had been married to an Anabaptist pastor, and they had come as refugees to the city of Strasbourg. Now, the Anabaptists and those in the Reformed tradition didn't get along all that well, but they showed up and they were protected there. It was still a place where they could have some safety from essentially the Roman Catholic forces that were out to get them. But over time, the husband of Idelette de Bure came to embrace this instruction that was being given by Calvin, so impressed with the quality of his understanding. And then he died. The husband died in a touch of the plague that came through on one occasion, leaving Idelette de Bure a widow with her two sons. Calvin actually presided at the funeral services and provided pastoral ministry. And then sometime later, he actually began to court Idelette de Bure, and they wound up getting married about that time, about 1541. If you ever come across a little book entitled Idelette, you should pick it up. It's a story of Idelette and her career and her life, written by a woman whose name is Edna Gerstner. Edna Gerstner was herself the wife of John Gerstner, who was a Presbyterian theologian and church history professor at the at the seminary in Pittsburgh for many years, for 40 years. And so this was her husband, and Edna Gerstner is the one who wrote this book. The dedication in the book is worth the price of the book all by itself. And here's how it goes. She says, "I dedicate this book to my beloved husband, John Gerstner, without whose help this book would have been much more interesting, but much less accurate." So Edna Gerstner had a wonderful story to tell about Idelette, but most of it, was sort of over the top, and John had to keep kind of honing her back and bringing her back to the facts. But anyway, it's a wonderful book nevertheless, so if you ever come across it, it's worth reading. All right, well, 1541. John Calvin receives a visitor from the city of Geneva. The visitor sits down with John and says, "John Calvin, the city council would like for you to come back to Geneva." Do you remember what Calvin said to Farel? Same answer. Calvin had absolutely no interest whatsoever in going back to that miserable place which stood for the most painful time of his life. But once again, these folks from Geneva were pleading with him. They said this libertine population created so much problem that we have finally been able to basically either get them out of the town or silence them, and now we are at a point where we need leadership. We need the leadership that we didn't appreciate when you were there the first time. Will you please come back? And Calvin did not want to go back, but there was considerable pressure that was put on him, not only by the city of Geneva, but by Martin Bucer, his pastor friend, his own wife, and others believed that this was actually God's call, that God was summoning him back to this ministry in Geneva. And so with a great deal of misgivings, right down to his toenails, he nevertheless agreed. And if you want to know what happened, you'll have to come back in 3 weeks. His comment at this point was, quote, "Rather would I submit to death 100 times than to that cross on which I had to perish daily 1,000 times over." But nevertheless, he returned to Geneva, and we'll see what happened